Welcome to What's Next Longevity Deal Talk. In this episode, Lloyd Morrisett, his avenues beyond Sesame Street. This special edition is made possible by Posit Science, maker of Brain HQ, personalized brain training for cognitive performance and more. I'm Fred Fishkin, along with Mary Furlong. Hi, Mary.
Hi, Fred. So this really is an important special edition of Longevity Deal Talk. So we're very honored to have with us today some special guests who were also very connected to Lloyd. I found this wonderful quote about Lloyd, who in the Markle annual report, he said that people used to ask him, what do you do? Do you give away money? And he didn't really like that question. And what his response was, I said we were most like a venture capital company, but that instead of financial profit, we measured ourselves by social benefit. And that was the Markle annual report in 1997. So I met Lloyd 10 years earlier, and I had this idea of SeniorNet, social network for older people. I had been looking for 2 years for funding after I wrote the book, Computers for Kids Over 60. At the same time, Lloyd was going around to universities like Stanford and asking the question, are any of you interested in the topic of older adults and technology? And no one answered. But someone who was in that seminar called me and said, I think you should talk to Lloyd. When I spoke to Lloyd, and I'll share more later, he said, I asked for a grant of $35,000 to build a social network. He said, I thought you should double that. And then over the course of the 10 years, he helped me grow the idea into a nonprofit organization.
That's just terrific, Mary. And with us today, the president of the Rose Bowl Institute, former executive vice president of the Aspen Institute, the executive director of the Aspen Institute Communications and Society Program, and much, much more, Charlie Firestone. Hi, Charlie.
Hello, good morning.
Just terrific. And with us from Posit Science, co-founder Jeff Zimman. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, it's great to be with you, and it's great to be here to talk about Lloyd.
Yes, Lloyd meant so much to all of us. He really helped form my career, I would say. So Charlie and Jeff, thank you for taking the time and for this special episode of Longevity Deal Talk.
Well, Mary, let's start out with more of an explanation. You've given us a little taste of why a tribute to Lloyd Morrisett, who passed away a month ago, makes sense for Longevity Deal Talk. He's best known as a co-creator, along with Joan Gans Cooney, of Sesame Street, and what an impact he had there as co-founder of Children's Television Workshop. The same year that Sesame Street went on the air, 1969, Lloyd joined the John and Mary Markle Foundation as president. And that took him down these other avenues, including some that focused on older adults. So Mary, we'll let you begin here. Tell us more about your connection to Lloyd and how this all began 40 or so years ago.
So one of the topics that we connected around was the social engagement of older adults. And Lloyd was from Oklahoma. And in the summers, he would describe how he'd go back with his parents and drive to Oklahoma. And when he got there, he'd see older adults on the front porch, kind of rocking away. And when we came to him with the idea of a different kind of front porch, a senior network that would connect older adults, it really intrigued him because he had looked at the social impact of television on children with Sesame Street. And now, years later in his career, we had looked at older adults and technology. So we started the first social network really before AOL, and it was on the Delphi network. And so once we started the forums and we began to see the social connection, we decided to have a conference in San Francisco. So we had a conference, about 100 people. Alan Kay was the keynote speaker. And what they came away with after the conference is a notion of spiritual efficacy, of older adults feeling more empowered through the technology. And over the 10 years, Lloyd helped to not only finance the Senior Net nonprofit, but help strategically grow the organization. So my work with older adults would not have happened without, I think, Lloyd Morrisett stepping up to do that first deal.
And just to explain to the audience a little bit how early this was, there were no web browsers back then, right?
Right. This was funded in 1985, started in 1986 at the university. And then 2 years later, we spun out and created a nonprofit organization. And then, 8 years after that, when the internet became so widely known, we went up to the launch of Windows 95, and I came back with a lot of people calling saying seniors on the internet is one of the 6 big ideas. And we had venture capitalists that wanted to invest in the company. And then Lloyd also helped through that transition. And we stayed friends. I saw him a couple of years ago, and it's always such a pleasure. He was a quiet speaker, but what he said meant so much. But I'll let Jeff and Charlie talk a little more about that and tell their stories.
Absolutely. Another avenue connected Lloyd to the Aspen Institute, an international nonprofit founded 74 years ago with a stated aim of promoting a free, just, and equitable society. Charlie, connect the dots for us.
Well, actually, I go back before Aspen. I was brought in as director of the Communications and Society program at UCLA in 1977. And Markle had been a funder of that, as they were a funder since Lloyd got there, and he understood the communications, the impact of communications. He and Markle were the major funders of much communications research, policy research, actual communications research throughout the country. And one of the arms was the UCLA Communications Law Program, which did public interest litigation as well as symposia and published a Federal Communications Law Journal and that kind of thing. So they were going to cut out funding for that. And I came and met with Lloyd, and they continued the funding, which was very fortunate. So yes, he was very instrumental in my career. That wasn't the first job I had, but it was an important one. And what I'd like to say about Lloyd is that he and Markle punched above their weight. What they figured out was that Markle was a relatively small foundation, but nobody was in the communications policy and communications research field. I mean, it was almost anybody who wanted to get funding for innovative research had to go look around, and Markle was really the place. And eventually there was a telecommunications policy research conference that they funded, and many of the people who reported, and this was the top researchers around the country who would come together with government officials and basically report on their research in the field. Well, fast forward 13 years later, 1990, and now I'm replacing a director of the Communications and Society program at Aspen. And again, Markle had been a supporter and had decided to quit funding that. So I had the same conversation. And so they said, well, okay, we'll just start out very small and, kind of continue till you get your legs and find somebody else. And one of the very first projects was to explore what Aspen does is convenes leadership level conferences with leaders and experts around a table in an exchange format. Well, they do other things, but this is I think the signature format. So it'd be 20 people around a table for a couple of days, where you would really not spend the time on lectures. You would have engagement, moderated engagement. And so what they did is they used our program as a testing ground for ideas about SeniorNet. And we would gather experts, and it was a great sounding board. I don't want to keep going on, but there is another project that I want to bring up that Markle supported. A woman named Ellen Miscavige at the Carter Center in Atlanta and also Emory University was a huge Russia watcher. And because she was at the Carter Center, when Jimmy Carter and Gorbachev decided that under Glasnost, there should be more understanding about what the media could do in as society starts relaxing their controls, they created something called the Commission on Radio and Television Policy. And what Markle, of course, they went to Markle for funding, as well as some others. And what Markle did was they funded us at Aspen to do a pre-conference each time, because these would be top network executives, both in the Soviet Union at that time. This is 1990, the Soviet Union and the U.S. To exchange ideas about policy, and basically so that the state-owned media people could understand what happens as you start to open up. And so what we would do is do a pre-conference where we'd set up the agenda and get materials so that the discussion of the commission would be, very informed. And then we would go to the commission when we had a commission meeting, which would be either in the Soviet Union, which quickly dissolved while we were doing this, or the US. And when it did dissolve, our organization was the only place where the heads of all the different broadcasting entities of what was then called the Confederation of Independent States, the former Soviet Union states, would meet. So we met in Kazakhstan, and we arrived with Jimmy Carter and rose petals on the tarmac, but also some very interesting policy. And we would come out with a book. This first one was Television and Elections. And that was really interesting because the Americans said, don't do ads, political ads, when you do elections, as you free up your country. And the Russians were saying, are you kidding? We get to have an ad where we don't have censorship? We're going to do that. You're crazy. But what we also found is that while we had this discussion, in each case, the Soviets, then the Russians and other independent states, a lot of the dialogue was them influencing each other as well with us. In other words, they weren't sitting there saying, oh, you Americans know what's right, and we're going to do what you say. But it led to discourse, which allowed for privatization. So we have television, radio, and privatization. We have television autonomy and the state, what to do about when the state imposes. We had television and minorities, and then a compilation, Democracy on the Air. And this was translated in countries all over, particularly the Eastern Bloc. So there were versions of these reports in not only Russian, but Hungarian and Kazakh and all other kinds of languages. So that was an instance where Markle, and by the way, Markle didn't look for the credit. People didn't go around talking about Markle, but they were a real anchor, a very understated anchor in the communications policy and research fields.
I agree with you about the quality of people that came and engaged. And it wasn't just SeniorNet, it was also Sarah Saja and her work. So the Aspen Institute, why would sessions, really an important vetting place, but they also did work in voter reform, I think. Do you remember that?
Anything that dealt with communications, from journalism, media, telecom, internet, information technology, artificial intelligence, we got into. And one of the areas was campaigns interaction with communications technology, particularly the internet. And I mean, we all know at the beginning, the internet, we were all encouraging. And by the way, when I started my career, which was really a long time ago, I was a big advocate for access to the media. And that's in those days, with the 3 networks, and you really wanted to have more access to women and minorities and viewpoints that weren't in the total mainstream. Now we have too much access. It's everybody's a publisher, and nothing is, well, things are filtered, but there's not enough filtering. I'm not saying censorship, but the issue has just flipped. And we see that in campaigns and the disinformation, whereas the internet was such a boon to communications, and now it's such a boon to disinformation. We can't lose sight of the good, but we did not anticipate that extent of where it would go.
It was so prescient, and they always found a way to shine a light on these issues, which were really ahead of their time. And so, Fred, should we turn to Jeff?
Yeah, that leads us to Posit Science, the pioneering company focused on cognitive performance. And Jeff, you brought Lloyd Morrisett onto a special advisory board many years ago?
Yes, I did. And first, let me say thank you, Fred, for inviting me, and Mary and Charlie. It's just great being here with you. But yes, and I think that's of interest to your Deal Talk listeners, because as you build an organization and do deals, it's good to be able to reach beyond your investors and your board to get the advice of a lot of people in a lot of different areas. And I actually first connected with Lloyd through Mary. And this is back in the early aughts. So I guess Lloyd was about 70 and aging just beautifully. I mean, he looked like he was in his early 50s. And when I think of Lloyd, I think mostly of his intensity, those bright blue eyes, always focused on you in every conversation, and just his ability to balance that intensity with a broad outlook and a lot of empathy. And in that first conversation, I discovered that Lloyd and I had quite a bit in common. I remember we talked about the joys of being a philosophy major. And due to that, I was also very interested in epistemology, the science of learning. So there was just a lot to talk about. And he very quickly agreed to be an advisor to Posit Science as we built out what later became Brain HQ, brain exercises. And we drew all the time on his expertise in psychology and education, and just in building an organization. Lloyd went far beyond that, I must say. He just gave good advice, good business advice when I needed it, good personal advice. And despite his equanimity and his empathy, when it came to talking about business, he was always very direct with me and never wishy-washy, and I really appreciated that. Lloyd was an avid user of Brain HQ, and early on, he gave us advice, which actually we got from quite a few sources, but he gave the advice in such a way that I still remember it. And the advice was to make it about brain exercise, not brain games. And Lloyd said something like, hey, this is serious science. So in the balance between entertainment and efficacy, you really need to tilt towards efficacy. And then he gave an example that I still carry with me. He says, I feel good about going to the gym, but I don't actually enjoy a lot of what I need to do there. It's good for you guys to make those exercises game-like, but you need to make it like a visit to the gym. Hard work you can feel good about, where you'll see change. And that was good at keeping us focused, because there was a lot of concern about, is this entertaining and fun enough? On another occasion, when I tried to reconcile some long-held differences between some of our scientists and a foundation that had been pretty aggressive in trying to, as they put it, extract a piece of the action for their grants to the university where the scientists conducted that research, I turned to Lloyd for advice, because I knew that he was very well connected in the foundation world. And here, too, he was amazingly direct. He said something like, listen, I've known these guys for years, especially the head of the foundation. He was a bully in business. He's still a bully now. even though he's turned to doing good works. And he's not a do-gooder like you guys, so be aware of that. And you know what you need to do with bullies. You need to be tough. So don't waste any more of your time here. On another occasion, I was... Sorry?
I said very, very interesting.
Yeah, on another occasion, I was really struggling with making a decision. I had a senior team member who had seriously misbehaved and probably needed to be dismissed, but he was a good guy, and I was torn by a desire to help him turn things around so he could stay on the team, and actually, doing what was best for the organization. And Lloyd again was super direct. He brought me up short. At the time I was serving as CEO, and he said, "You're the CEO of a startup and not a GD social worker. You've done your best with this guy. He needs to change to save himself, and you need to make a decision that you find challenging. So make your decision." More than anything, Lloyd was brilliant. He was a lifelong student, a very generous man. He taught me something every single time we talked, and we talked frequently in the early years. And I just imagine he had that impact on everyone he ever worked with.
And his background in psychology, it sounds like, played a role in almost all of his dealings to some extent.
Well, it certainly played a role in working with us. And, at one point he told me that if they had interactive TV when he had started Sesame Street, he would have been looking for something like what we were doing to help kids learn better and develop skills earlier. So he was also always looking forward. We also had discussions about, where we were going with artificial intelligence and where we were going with virtual reality. And he was very much interested in what comes next and how is it a tool to make society better.
Jeff, I thought that you described him so well, and I found that I would save up my questions when they were really important questions. And I would be really careful about what I wore. I don't know why, but I would think that if I had time with him, it was so wonderful. And he liked to celebrate too. So when we got funded and got approved by the board, and that was every year for 10 years. Sometimes we would get 2 years of funding, and it was our anchor funding. And then we'd have to go out and get other funding, but we would always celebrate. And Edie, who Charlie remembers, the program officer, would have a Kir Royale, and then we'd have a lovely dinner and wonderful conversation. And one year I saw someone playing Barney at the next table. He said, he wasn't such a fan of Barney because of, the Sesame Street, but that quiet leadership, and you couldn't ask for a better mentor. And I think all of us are a little more seasoned now, and we probably step into the role of mentor, but we could not have had another person to listen so well, to ask the right questions, and someone you could so trust, right?
Well, the breadth of his impact and influence is really beyond measure. I mean, listening to all of you and knowing what he did with Sesame Street, and that alone, right? The impact on societies around the world has been so deep.
Yeah, I think Mary's point about trust is really significant, because there are people you trust and people you really trust. And Lloyd you never questioned his sincerity, his devotion to what's right, what's the right thing to do. And so he was really a good person to turn to when you had those kinds of questions. And I think in both your cases where you had actual organizations that were kind of on the brink, he would have been just a perfect mentor and advisor as well as funder. Of course, it always helped that he had the funds, right. But he didn't have that many funds. And it was also interesting that he, I don't know, maybe there were instances where the board actually turned him down, but that would have been extremely unusual. I think, again, the board had great trust in where Lloyd took the foundation. which, Markle was I think he was a coal baron. I mean, he had nothing to do with communications. And he turned that foundation into a major player with a relatively modest endowment in that field.
But he also, I think, did very well with the endowment. So
Oh, yeah,
one of
true.
the
That's true.
lessons that as an entrepreneur that we learned is how to manage up to the board. And he also taught us how to recruit top tier talent, because I think, Jeff, you also had the governor of Texas on your board at that time, the woman who wore red heels and said women could do everything men could do, just backward.
Oh, Ann Richards.
We had a lot of we had a wide range of people with very different backgrounds and very deep expertise, including Ann Richards and Lloyd and many others. And it really made it fun for me as the CEO at the time to go out and get advice from such knowledgeable people and walk away always with golden nuggets from each one of them. But Lloyd, the relationship continued really for 20 years. And I was surprised when he decided to move from the Northeast to San Diego. But again, he delivered another little nugget about aging. He said, well, it's the kind of place where it'll be the last address I ever have. And most importantly, where I'll be close to my granddaughters and get to spend more time with them.
And the day I visited him there in La Jolla, it was a beautiful sunny day, and what's not to like. And so he even taught us a little bit about that phase of our life of retiring. But let's just talk a minute about how, fast forward to today, as Charlie was talking about the television, the communication issues. At CES this year, there was just an abundance of age tech startups. Venture capitalists called me this morning to talk about care tech as a new area of investment. And so we've seen, lots and lots of companies now, incubators and investors all focusing on this area, and companies like Get Set Up with very rapid growth, and Oats and ARP and their work with technology. What do you see? What would Lloyd say today about, Jeff, just the number of people using Posit Science, 1,400 a week in San Diego, right? I mean, what would he say today about how interesting to have that conversation, right? That's what I miss most when you lose someone. You don't get that conversation.
But the nice thing is when you know someone that long, you hear from him forevermore.
Yes.
So he would in a very kind way tell us to work harder. Mm-hmm. And that, our mission was to get everyone in the world who we could help, which when we started was mostly focused on older people facing age-related cognitive decline, and then kind of expanded to people with all sorts of cognitive conditions, and then just kind of expanded to, the person with credit for this is Tom Brady, who came to us after a long hiatus after his first 3 Super Bowls and told us how much Brain HQ was helping, and then went on to win 4 more. And we learned from Tom that it's actually about helping everyone with a brain have a better brain, and taking people whose performance is superhuman, like Tom Brady, or members of special forces or whatever, and really just giving people the tools to, as my co-founder Mike Merznick is fond of saying, captain their own ship. And Lloyd was very much somebody who lived being the captain of his ship.
California just gave away $89 million to do work with digital access. And a lot of that's going to training and working with older adults. Charlie, tell us about your work today at the Rose Bowl. I'm sure some of the seeds of this early work live on, right?
Well, the Rose Bowl Institute champions sportsmanship, leadership, and citizenship and sportsmanship as citizenship. So what we try to do is, the first thing I got from the communications field, bringing it to this sports values field, applying positive sports values to civil society, is that we're in an attention economy. And the attention economy means we have information overload, but attention is the scarcity. And how do we get attention today but hate, fear, anger, sensationalism, sports? And so what we do is, among other things, is have where athletes go into schools and talk to kids. We have talking points we develop with the National Constitution Center to show the parallels between sportsmanship and citizenship as a form of civic literacy. So that's one area. Another is to just sell sportsmanship. So we have ads, we have little vignettes of good sportsmanship, understanding that, like Sesame Street, where you show the positive and you don't want to just, have the negative images up there. So we show positive instances of sportsmanship with the tagline, "Sportsmanship, it's how you play the game," and brought to you by Rose Bowl Institute and whatever league. We've got the Ivy League, the Sun Belt Conference for starters, but we hope to have that all over the country. We do women's empowerment. We have a women's empowerment symposium. We have race and sports, things that where the communications field, which touches everything. We did a lot on race and media, come into to the sports world. And what Jeff was just talking about in terms of Tom Brady's thinking, we just had a what we call a rose table dialogue. It's like the old Aspen seminars, but we have a rose table, which is in the shape of the Rose Bowl, finished in rosewood, that we set up in the Rose Bowl locker room. And we just had a rose table dialogue on mental health of athletes, and it fits right into that. So all of it interconnects in one way or another. But that's the Rose Bowl Institute is new. It's 2 years old, 2.5 years old, and thanks for giving me a little opportunity to explain it. rosebowlinstitute.org.
It's exciting for me to learn about that. And Jeff, I have to also thank Posit Science, who's been a big part of our conferences that we do. We're coming up on our 20th Longevity Venture Capital Summit. So that brings together entrepreneurs, investors, all looking at technology and aging. And we have been doing our podcast. So I think Lloyd would be happy that we're doing this work. He'd be happy that we're mentoring. We can all look up to him as one of the integrity bookends in our life.
Speaking of Lloyd mentoring, the first program officer that I had when I was at UCLA was a woman named Jean Furstenberg, who went on to head up the American Film Institute. I mean, he mentored some heavyweights, and Kathy Clark, who went on to run CASE at Duke University. So there are a number of people who came into Lloyd's orbit, not just the grantees, but even his employees who we moved on to higher and better areas.
And Charlie, Kathy, whose schedule at Duke University didn't allow for us to join us today, starts off her LinkedIn profile with this. This is a direct quote from there. In the early 1990s, the co-founder of Sesame Street told me during a lunch interview his foundation liked to put people, money, and ideas together to create social good. I almost choked on my soup to realize his enterprise had helped teach me to read, as well as millions of others around the world. I wanted to make an impact like that. Parentheses, yes, I took the job. 30 years later, I have put my energy into improving how people, money, and ideas can come together for good. So that's the quote from Kathy Clark's LinkedIn profile.
Well, it's hard to say it any better than that. Thank you, Charlie and Jeff, for joining us today and for sharing this wonderful set of memories and remembering Lloyd's leadership.
And Mary, thank you for bringing Lloyd into my life.
Oh,
And thanks for inviting me to share. Really appreciate it.
great to be with you all.
Mary, before we wrap up, a couple of deals we want to note. Mitch Yoel, CEO at Journey Health and Lifestyle, has announced the acquisition of LifeWalker Mobility, maker of the UpWalker family of products. And we'll have more about that going forward, but we've kind of been waiting for this one.
Yes, I have, and I think mobility is going to be a big area to watch this year. So we know about 5 or 6 startups that are coming out in the mobility space.
Terrific. And from our friends at Ziegler Linkage Funds, K4 Connect is rolling out a new integration with NetSmart to help users coordinate care and staffing more effectively. Staffing is a big issue everywhere, it seems, Mary.
Absolutely. I just spoke with Meet Caregivers this morning, and when you talk to the principals in senior housing, staffing is the key issue.
VitalTech has rolled out its new workflow automation solution. It's called VitalTech Care Plus. And Smart Meter says its partnership with Blue Star Telehealth has reduced systolic blood pressure in 42% of patients in a remote patient monitoring program. That kind of technology is certainly the kind of thing we expect to see much, much more of.
You know, a real theme during this session, this podcast, was about social impact through the use of technology. And I think that's been an anchor through our work over the past 20 years. And I am pleased to say that ARP is continuing to support our conferences and our podcast in the year to come, and that we will have a competition around the topic of social isolation in June. So it'll be our 20th year of the Longevity Venture Summit in June. We've given away over $200,000, $10,000 a year. Our winner last year, Neurosantis, you might remember, Fred, was then funded by the Mayo Clinic. So we will challenge the entrepreneurs in the audience to submit business plans around social isolation. And I think Lloyd would be proud of this tapestry of talent continuing to work on investment for social impact.
Well, that is great news. And obviously, we're very happy to be working with AARP and the Age Tech Collaborative once again. And again, we want to thank Charlie and Jeff for spending time with us. And Lloyd, thank you for the life you lived. Our gratitude as well to Posit Science for helping to make this episode possible. You can find all of our podcasts, including What's Next, Living Longer, Better, Smarter, at maryfurlong.com/podcasts. Thank you for spending time with us.